session, so you can unmute yourself then. And thank you for joining.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nigel here. Lovely to see you all. I'm just going to leave it a few more minutes so we could admit people in from the waiting room, and then we'll get going in a few minutes. As you can see, we are live on streaming on YouTube, which you can find on our webpage if you're having difficulties with the Zoom platform. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to July's Protected Learning Time for the Vale of York CCG. It's wonderful to see so many people on our call today, and actually we've got over 250 people registered to come and listen to the keynote and also to be in the sessions today. It's a shame that we're not face-to-face, and the last time I think we met, I was hoping that we would be face-to-face at this time, but understandably, we're still in a situation where we needed to do this virtually. And I do know that your feedback from the previous Protected Learning Times has always been about how good it is to get together to meet people in person, but hopefully that day will come soon. Just a couple of things from me, really. The first thing is to say thank you again for all your hard work, dedication to everything that you're doing for all the residents of the Vale of York CCG. Everything that you're doing at the front line at primary care, but also in the vaccination hubs and the vaccination programme has been quite amazing. And we are really, really appreciative of everything that you're doing and have done. And thank you again for today, for sorting out your surgeries, being able to close and come to this session. A few bits of housekeeping. We are recording this session, and the main session that we're going to go into in a minute with Myron, we are using the Zoom function, so please keep yourself on mute, but please ask questions in the chat function, and we're going to have 2 question sort of breaks that hopefully we can hear you, so please put your hands up if you want to come in and ask a question of Myron. It would be really useful for us for that. Thank you. Once you leave this keynote session, the workshops will be at 3:15 and 4:30, and you should have had those links sent to you, and that's in MS Teams. If you are having issues with that, you can find the links on the Vale of York CCG website, and I think Victoria is going to post the link in the chat box as well. As ever, we thrive on your feedback around these events, and if they're useful, what is useful, what you want to see in the future. So please give us some feedback about the event and in the sessions as you go through the afternoon. Finally, I'd like to thank the facilitators of the workshop sessions who are coming to talk about areas that we hopefully are very much of interest to you. So again, please give us your feedback on that. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Myron Rogers to you. And Myron is an author, speaker, and consultant with the practice who specialize in sort of large-scale organizational change and leadership development. But I've got to know Myron around systems change and how systems can change and the thinking around that. And Myron was also, knows Becky Malby very well. And Becky, if you might remember, came to us in the PLT last year talking about what we wanted to keep from the changes in the pandemic. And Myron was one of her contributors to her podcast series around leading through the pandemic. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass over to Myron. I'm going to look at the chat function, and I'll come in at sort of different times to help Myron with the Q&A. So thank you very much again, and over to you, Myron.
Well, I started off muted, so there's a good beginning. How are you, folks? I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks for the intro and the welcome, Nigel, and to all of you who are out there. I think today, in the brief time that we have together, I'm going to talk about change, but change from a perspective that you're probably not used to hearing. I would guess maybe some of you are, but we'll see. First I have this ad up there. Oh, come on. Frozen slides. Sorry, there we go. This is my favorite change motto of the day. If you can find a path with no obstacles, it probably doesn't lead anywhere. Or then again, there's this spontaneous group in which things do lead somewhere, the overthrow of regimes. I want to start in a place. Everything I talk about, I've had my hand in some way. These are not just things that I've researched; they're things that I've touched. So this is a picture that probably many of you don't recognize it right away. It's 7 astronauts in the space shuttle mission in the United States. This is the Columbia mission. I don't know if you know what happened to the Columbia astronauts, but those 7 astronauts are all dead. And the question is, what killed them, right? And I would say the culture is what killed them. And this line, the culture eats strategy, which many of you I'm sure have heard, feels very true. And we're going to talk a little about why it is true, why culture persists through time and space, even when it no longer serves us. So the Columbia space mission, just so you know, the space shuttle had been running about 20 years at that point. It took off from Cape Canaveral and went up to the space station and back often. Columbia, it was always a a risk with the space shuttle that at takeoff, because of the extreme heating and cooling, the insulation around the engines would get brittle, break apart, and hit the back of the shuttle, which had heat protective tiles on it that were quite sensitive. Right? And so in 20 years, this had never happened. So you're familiar with the psychological phenomena called risk abatement? It says that when a known risk doesn't happen over a long period of time, we think the risk has gone away, but it hasn't. It's exactly the same as it always was. And so with the Columbia mission, it took off, they had cameras at the takeoff platform. They saw a piece of insulation hit the back of the shuttle. They convened an emergency team of engineers. It was 60 engineers in a room, and all sitting there thinking, "Oh my goodness, we have astronauts up there, and they might be in trouble. What do I do to save them?" By the way, when I asked this question among many people in the NHS about how did these engineers feel at that moment, they mostly say, well, they're afraid they're going to get blamed, which actually reveals something about the culture of the NHS, not about what these people were thinking. What they were thinking was, how do we save these lives? And then their boss walks into the room and says this: "I don't really think there's much we can do, so it's not really a factor during the flight because there's not much we can do about it." What she essentially was saying is, there's nothing wrong, but if there is nothing wrong, there's nothing we can do. So what did the engineers do at that point? Well, I wish we had just an open mic at this point, because what the engineers did at that point was a bit of a surprise. They set about proving that this was correct, that Linda Ham's statements were correct. And in fact, false. There was a way to find out the damage on the Columbia. There was a low-level engineer 3 levels down from this team who had a friend at the Defense Department and asked to take a high spy satellite photo, which Defense Department said, when do you want it? Where? And he brought that information back to the team, and his superiors said, we can't do this. We're a civilian organization, and that's the defense, and we don't have a right to talk to them. So they denied the information. The other thing is, 20 years prior to this, there was another, 10 years prior to this, was another one, the Challenger mission, which blew up on takeoff, killing the astronauts, and they developed multiple ways to get stranded astronauts down from space. So there is no reason that this had to happen, except that the culture refused to recognize the truth of this moment. The culture refused to pay attention to it, to say that this actually mattered, and to act differently around it. So I just told this question, which I think should be part of our lives, which is, why do good intentions generate unintended consequences? When we think about what, in any situation, what it is we really intend, what really happened. This can be so in our families, in our close relationships, our intimate relationships, but it can also most certainly be true in our organizational lives. So here's one answer of why do we get unintended consequences: silos, in which the information from one part of the system doesn't travel to the other part of the system, in which information is seen as hierarchical. So Nigel at the head of the pyramid here today, sorry Nigel to pick on you this way, Nigel at the head of the pyramid here today, seeing his information as more important than me down at the bottom in the lower portion of this. And the reality is, information has no hierarchy. It is information that seems utterly insignificant, when it joins with something else, suddenly becomes significant. I once was doing a seminar, and I had a leader from Walt Disney World in it, who was responsible for the properties at Walt Disney World. And this is soon after Walt Disney World opened. There was a hotel property that had a 18-hole championship golf course, PGA championship golf course on it. And for years, for 2 years after it was open, it had the lowest level of reservations of any property on the site. They couldn't figure out why. They spent millions of dollars on consultants, on management consultants, on marketing consultants. One day, the property manager was getting in an elevator. The doors opened. A woman saw him and said, "I've been meaning to speak to you for 2 years. I'm glad I found you." He was a little freaked out, but he got in the elevator anyway. And she said, "I know what the problem is." And he looked at her, he said, "Oh yeah, what?" She said, "Well, I'm head of telephone reservations, and I answer the phone by saying, welcome to whatever the name of the place was, cited on 18-hole championship golf course." And the property manager said, "Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what should happen." And she said, "No, absolutely not." She said, "Women are calling for their young families to have a vacation at Walt Disney World. They do not want their husbands near this place." And that insignificant piece of information that sat out there for two years cost millions of dollars because it couldn't travel to the right place. It couldn't combine in the right way and make sense out of things. So here's my answer to that. If you all just put some money in a kitty, about £1 million, I'll come reorganize you this way. That's a joke, by the way. It's a little hard to convey jokes on the thing. This is, you can't really, I don't know if you can see it up at the top, but this is a former client, and this is a picture of emerging regional integrated delivery systems and networks, a simplified example of collaboration and competition among key stakeholders. So if you think about how real work gets done, it gets done more like this than it does the traditional organogram. There we go. And it doesn't get done this way. See how complicated this is? This is the original, something else I worked on. This is the original chart, organogram, if you will, of Obamacare. A bit complicated in here. And when you look at this, who created it? Well, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. In the center, that's whoever puts themselves in the center, that's who created the diagram. But can you find patients in there? And you might find it takes you a while, but it's way down on, as you're looking at the slide, it's way down on the bottom right. Those are patients in a smaller box than the IRS, the tax authority. So anyway, which way does real work get done? Real life happen? It happens in this complex chart. It is not even as complex as it actually is, as it actually happens. And so, one of the things we focus on, if we want to change this system, I have this delay, sorry. We want to change the system, the first place we go almost always is structure, policy, and procedures, the things that you can see, the phenomena of organizational life. But as soon as we change a structure, to go back to this messy network chart, as soon as we change a structure, we screw up, really, relationships. We begin to, relationships that have formed to do good work suddenly get broken. And people resist it. And the structure, policy, procedure thing has something to do with my identity. And my identity, once it's confronted by people telling me that, we have a change of vision, and the things that you were valued for, we no longer value, that creates a form of resistance in me. And I will resist you, not because I dislike you, not because I'm a problem in the system, but because you have confronted my identity, and living systems will always preserve their identity. We'll just go ahead. Living system preserves its identity. It will change in order to preserve it. I'm older than most of the people who are out there, I bet. I'm willing to bet. And one of the things I know is that I am the same person I was when I was 20 years old, and I'm not the same person I was at 20 years old. When I was 20, if I saw something, if something came into my life that I had never experienced before, the chances were about 50-50 that I'd engage with it in a way that enhanced my identity, my ability to live my life. today, almost nothing would disturb me from my path. So some people might have heard of these things. These are Myron's maxims. They come from real long-term study of systems, but they're very simple statements that I think can be helpful in life, work, the systems that you're working in. So I'll go through them briefly, and then we'll take a little break for some questions. One is that people own what they help create, full stop. By the way, let me just say that if you work with these maxims, one of the things that happens is you get unintended consequences, because you always will get unintended consequences with any kind of living system. But the unintended consequences tend to be in the direction you want them to be, rather than destructive or in the direction you don't want them to be. So anyway, people own what they help create. You know this to be true, right? When people have done something for you and give it to you in the work environment, home environment, whatever else, and they say this is the way it's going to be, you actually don't own it. And you may take that thing and recreate it in your own image. Real change happens in real work. This is an interesting one, because what is real work? Well, that's a great question to begin a conversation with your colleagues. What's the real work that we're trying to do here? What are we actually trying to change to do? Those who do the work do the change, which is a statement of honoring and respecting the talent, experience, and knowledge, expertise and knowledge of those who are doing the work in any system. If you want to make a system healthier, you connect it to more of itself. This is true of any living system. Instead of arguing over what's the thing that we need to do to start and what's the sequence we need to do, you can start anywhere. You start with anything that's significant. And as soon as you begin working with it, it's going to provoke different ways of, it's going to provoke itself, and it will start showing you what's working, what isn't, and you need to pay attention to it. And then finally, the process you use to get to the future is the future you get. Let me say this again. The process you use to get to the future is the future you get. If you want a collaborative organization, you can't get there through a command and control hierarchy. You have to start with collaboration as best as you know how to do it, and to grow that capacity over time. So, any questions or comments right now? Comments are welcome. Questions are welcome.
And there's no comments in the chat box, but I was wondering, Myron, whether it might be worth defining what you meant by a living system. And most of us on the call are members of a primary care practice, general practice, or surgery practice, or a PCN. So how are they sort of examples of living systems? What would you say?
Well, if we go back to the chart, we just imagine it, the identity, information, relationships, and the traditional organogram. The traditional organogram is based on a notion that the best way to organize human endeavor is to organize it as a machine. It actually does, you can trace it back to its Industrial Revolution roots, and it says that the best way to manage human beings is to treat them like machines. So in most organizations, there is I have to be careful with this, a human resources department that has roles identified very clearly, and it looks like an organization organogram or organization chart where I come from, in which people fit into boxes and have their kind of extra contribution cut off. The living systems is that we are living human beings. We are not machines. And as we work together, we generate all the things of life, which are surprises, complexity, things emerge, the system self-organizes itself. You think about culture and how hard it is to change. All those are at work in those systems. So another question or comment?
I'll open the floor and see if anybody wants to come in and ask anything. Either put your hand up or unmute and shout, or put something in the chat if you want to.
Okay.
Angela has asked, what do you mean by self-organizing?
So as I go through, one example of this is as I go through life, I become a better and better expression of myself, right? So I grow into myself over time. That's one form of self-organizing. Another form of self-organizing is, let's say you work in a primary care practice. It has a culture, it has a way of doing things, of seeing things, of reacting to patients, to the economy, to politics, to each other. It has a quality of relationships. So then if it needs to change, what happens? Well, more often than not, it will try and change the thing that's making it change, if that makes sense to you. That it will continue to generate the same quality of relationships, the same sense of what it is in the world, same way of interacting with the world, unless over a long period of time it gets more and more disturbed and begins to see the changes in the environment are things that it has to respond to. Okay.
So does that mean that disruption and disturbance is good in that respect?
It does, well, if they're the right kind, right? Nigel, you and I have had this conversation before. If the disturbances are the right kind of disturbances, excuse me, they can be really positive and they can provoke me to adopt a new way of understanding the world, new way of seeing the world, new way of acting in the world. So, you know, I mean, we've talked about this, but, you know, creating integrated health and care from primary care to population health and other aspects of it, that's a disturbance in the system that comes from the longer term, not paying attention to those things and suddenly turning our attention to them.
Great. Zolf, you've put your hand up. Do you want to unmute and come in?
Yeah. Trying to get my camera going. Just bear 1 second. There is a obsession with process in healthcare, and sometimes the fear of doing something wrong. And that generates the culture that we end up having, is that it becomes very inflexible. Is there a balance between acceptance of some kind of process and a living proposition or an organization that can still be pliable and still get the same results?
I'm not sure I have the question, Zolf, but
So the question is, there is a fixation with process in healthcare systems. And we also, I totally get the whole idea of self-organizing, organic, sort of see what you see and do what you do, what's in front of you at times. Is there something that can combine the two and enable a cultural shift?
yeah, I don't know about the combining of the two because I'm not exactly sure what that would entail, but I do think that these two can walk together, and we have plenty of examples of it. So, for instance, I'm for a couple of years I've had an orthopedic problem, and so I've been going in and out of the hospital. So I understand the system from a different way than I used to, being inside it. One of the things that happens is inside that hospital, I just have incredible, great care, fabulous, caring, passionate, compassionate, technically solid. And then when I leave to go home, I can't get a damn phone number to get back in, right? Pardon my language. So there are two systems going on. One of them is a system of defensive protection, the way in which you can't find your way back into the system when you're outside it. And the other one is a system of, caring, compassion, doing good work. Could those two come together? Could you create a system that didn't feel so exclusionary and harmful and whatnot? I'm talking about the outside the system one. We know that can happen. There's all sorts of research on honesty in the system. So, we have all sorts of processes to protect ourselves against being blamed, essentially. Go back to the NASA example. We have all sorts of systems that do that. And there's lots of research that just shows when people step outside those and just sit together with each other in honesty, in direct, transparent clarity, that all sorts of horrible problems that tended to exist begin to evaporate. So that's too short an answer for a complex question, but thank you.
Thank you.
Myron, there's another, Amy Bascom-Fox has put in some really good comments. Amy, do you want to unmute and just explain your thoughts? Are you able to do that for us, rather than me just read it out?
Hi, yeah. So I'm a clinical case manager in the Vale of York CCG. My background is as a chemotherapy nurse in acute oncology, so I've been a clinical member of staff for a long time. And I think my experience of any change process is that many staff react like it's something that's happening to them as opposed to with them, and also often feels like a bureaucratic process as opposed to seeing the benefit to our patients. So a large part of any nursing role, any GP role, is that you advocate for the people you care for. And I suppose when we talk about this disconnect, it's how much of the process actually feels tangible and something we can engage with as staff, so that we see the purpose of it and understand the whole process. There's all sorts of reasons why that's very difficult. Clinical staff, there's a lot of them. They work in all sorts of different places. They work shifts. And especially in a pandemic, it's hugely tiring, and workforce morale is very, very low. But I also know that many clinical staff have great ideas, are passionate about positive change, and would engage very well. And I suppose I just wonder, when you talk about ownership of change and identity, what you would suggest doing between those kind of, I would call it a barrier, but when you look at people who are involved in policy and structural change and managing those things versus clinical staff on the front line who work with patients day in, day out.
Amy, so first, thank you for that. That was powerful. And secondly, I don't have a lot to say because I agree with you completely. No.
Oh, thank you. It's always nice when that happens in life.
So, going back to the maxims, people know what they help create, full stop. Those who do the work do the change. And those are statements of a kind of truth that you can't get away from, and that as Nigel knows, and as the people I work with know, true engagement isn't consultation. It's actually, we get Amy and Zulf to sit in a room with the policymakers and the chief execs around an issue that is critical, and they work out how to respond to that themselves. The basic process in this. No, let me step back for a minute. I think that this is an extraordinary moment in health and care in the UK, maybe beyond the UK as well, in which people do recognize that mechanistic, kind of box-like hierarchical structure of doing change no longer really works, and that there is or there must be a better way. So people are experimenting more. I think people like Amy, people like Zulf, you need to exercise your voice, and you need to find people in the system, and they do exist, find people in the system that you work in who have sympathetic ideas. You know, it's finding the chorus that you can sing with. I mean, some people say, why would you want to, you know, help the chorus sing? I said, well, because they sound better. That's why it works better. So, yeah. And there are tons of examples of this going on now, of more and more people being more and more engaged with one another across boundaries, across hierarchies. Certainly the response to COVID demonstrated that people are capable of working across all their hierarchies, professional and organizational, and working beyond the boundaries of their institutions as well. So thank you. I might go on with a bit unless, thank you. I wanted to talk about a couple of aspects of, you know, Nigel asked about living systems, They have these different dynamics. One of them is cognition. How do we know what we know? And the sciences about cognition these days are really quite exciting, and we're learning tons about how we know. So I'm going to show you a little animated video right now. So I want you to pay attention to what it is you're seeing, because I'll ask a question about it at the end. So there you go. So what did you see? Could some people just come in and make a quick comment about what you saw? What were you watching?
Whether anybody wants to unmute and say anything or put something in the chat about what you thought you saw. Was it the political cycle of the NHS? Was it? That's what I wondered about.
No? Hey, there's 222 of you.
Trying to conform to barriers, just breaking down the barrier. That's what Laura's said there.
Breaking down the barrier.
Beating a head against a brick wall.
Is it more about the two different triangles in the circle and one triangle being more aggressive?
Ah, right. An aggressive triangle. Yes. Thank you.
The circle and triangle ran off together, leaving an upset triangle. Bullying, somebody's put. Good. Relationships. One triangle trying to trick the other to do its job. Limited opportunity to break out.
Okay. Due to time. So where did the information that made up the story of what you said come from? Anyone? Where did the information come from that made up that story you told?
Well, Siobhan's put in, is this all about perception?
Is this all about perception? Yes. You know, I mean, pretty quickly, let's be clear. All the information in those stories came from you. They aren't in the picture. It's just movement around. This is my perception, as Siobhan said. It's my sense of what really went on. And what I'm doing is I'm taking my current experience, the lens through which I see things, and attributing it to something else. So in the science of cognition, one of the things we know is that anything I see or experience, most of the information that makes up that thing comes from me. So for instance, a tree, when I look outside and I see a tree, I have to recognize, I don't have to recognize what's at operation. What's operating is that I am drawing on kind of the cultural sense of treeness that's been ingrained in me since I was a baby, an infant, and probably before. I have that whole sense of it. And then I have my experiences, my memories, every moment that I've ever been around trees is within me somewhere. And as I see that, it triggers a response that is flowing all the time through me, which is 80% of the information that makes up the tree that I see comes from me. 20% comes from the outside. So that 20% is seen as a disturbance. It just disturbs or provokes me into seeing a tree the way I see a tree. The tree that I see includes when I was 5 years old, I climbed a tree and fell out and broke my arm. That memory is there. It's there in a variety of ways, chemically, electronically, whatnot. So if my experience is 80% mine and 20% the world, what does that say about how we work together? What our work is working together? How do we understand each other? How do we come to work on the same page, as it's called? Can skip that. Hopefully this is going to work. This is a little bit more. This picture is Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. He's a social psychologist. He broke through the kind of hypotheticals of economics that were assumed pure rationality. And he shows that it doesn't. But this is him, just a little clip, and I hope the sound will work.
This is a personal story that happened to me a couple of months ago after the book came out, and I was sorry because I would have put it in the book if it had come out in time. My wife and I went out to dinner with a couple, and later we went home, and so we're talking in bed, and she says, about the men, she says, he is sexy. Okay? And then she says something that is completely bizarre, but very clear. She says, and I'll go slowly, he doesn't undress the maid himself. He doesn't undress the maid himself. Okay? And I think she's gone crazy. I mean, what are you saying? He doesn't undress the maid himself? Well, it actually wasn't what she had said. She had said he doesn't underestimate himself. Now, but I heard, clear as bell, I heard he doesn't undress the maid himself. And one word creates a context, and you get very complicated interpretations, which are completely biased by that context. This is the way that our mind works. This is the way that associative memory works. And notice what happens in this case. It's coherent. Things go together. So you are ready for a certain set of ideas, including he doesn't undress the maid himself, which don't make any sense, but they're related. But they're related to that theme. This is the way I think our mind works.
There you go. Yeah, he doesn't undress the maid himself. Any comments or thoughts about this? I would tell you, for me, it has huge implications about how we work together. It says that, most of the time I'm responding to myself, not to you. Most of the time we don't have a shared view of what's going on. Most of the time our work needs to be, how do we get to a shared sense of what's significant, what matters?
Yeah, Julie Hastie's put in the chat box, proves the need for good communication and confirmation what you have said has been heard appropriately.
Yeah. Anyone else? I'm just wondering about, do people have ideas about how to make up for this apparent barrier between us? I'll tell you that I here's another one of these strange examples that I have of things that I've done. So I worked with the U.S. Army on how to learn during battle. And it's built a bit around Kahneman's work in this. How to learn during battle, their motto was learn or die. And here's what they were trying to do, and see if this sounds at all familiar, because, even though it's the Army, might pay attention to what it implies about our work together. So what the Army was trying to do is to create in the average soldier the ability to see something they'd never seen before in the battlefield and to take action on it in a way that was the direction that the whole needed to go. And I don't necessarily mean physical direction, I just mean, psychological direction. The average soldier could take action on their own without an order that would be in the direction of the group as a whole, having seen something they'd never seen before. And how did they get there? Well, what they understood is that everybody's perception of a moment is incomplete and therefore wrong, and that there is no hierarchy to information, that the commander's view of what happened in a significant incident and the private's view are just views, and they're both incomplete. And if we don't build a shared sense of reality, if we don't build an agreement about this is what actually happened, then we all learn, because this is what human beings do. Human beings learn all the time. People say, people stop learning. It's not true. They're just mostly learning things we don't want them to. But you have this learning goes on that's fragmented because we don't share a view of what the reality is. And so we need to, that essentially is the work in this. And what Amy was saying, I think it was Amy, was saying, this certainly backs this up. I mean, part of what Amy is saying, whether she meant to or not, is that we don't have a shared view of reality, that whoever the politicians are or holding the levers of the change process, it's incomplete because they don't have the view of all the experience that's available to them. They don't have the experience of me as a person in the system who has a lot of has years of experience and could lend that to the plans. Sorry. So here we are, what we do, not what we say about what we do. And this is the lesson of that. You cannot direct another living system, you can only disturb it, right? And if you have children, you know the truth of this statement. So this is basically how do we get into a sense of what's significant in the world together? That's the work. I did that. Now, there's another dynamic of living systems called emergence, and people know this word, right? I mean, it's a common word. It's all over the place now. Emergence changed my professional practice. I mean, really understanding it. It's most often represented this way. I'm not sure. I think I can make this work. Yes, these are starlings, I'll tell you a couple stories about starlings. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you're watching this video move along, they this looks like totally random, but in fact, the birds aren't hitting one another. They're not hitting telephone poles. They're not crashing into things. They're moving along, finding their way to food and water. And some of the ways we now understand that some of the ways they flock like this are to deceive birds of prey. It's pretty dramatic, eh? Come on. There we go. Yeah. In emergence, one of the things that happens is over time, as a system interacts with itself, it generates, I'm going to use some strange words, they're strange phrases, it generates global capacity. That global capacity says that nothing you experience can be reduced to its constituent parts, that it is actually a whole thing. So here's an example. What is sugar made of? Has three atoms: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. That's sugar. Which one is sweet? See, you can't find the sweetness. It's a property of the whole, and it only exists in that whole, and you couldn't reduce it back to the sweetness of sugar is its own property. So one of the ways of thinking about that is it's similar to culture in an organization. A culture arises, it's a way of perceiving the world, a way of seeing the world, a way of interacting with the world. And you can't, if you try to undo that culture, you can't do it. What you can do, however, and this is a piece about emergence, is that you can recognize the quality of relationships that exist in the system, the organization, your primary care office, whatever it is, your family. It's the nature of relationships, the way that we are connected together. And if you want to change a culture, what you change is the way in which people are connected to one another in the work. Okay? Any more comments or questions, Nigel?
Not at the minute on those bits, but I was just interested in when we were talking about sort of flat conversations or shared reality or understanding that, and then thinking about change and how you would change a system or a process. How wide do you go with those people that come into that design process? How do you know that you've got to all the bits that you need to get to? Are there any?
Yeah, I mean, so you don't at first, right? One is you have something that you want to do, something that you feel needs doing, that has energy for people. The first thing you do is having defined the problem. Who's connected to that problem? I ask, generally questions like, who does this matter to? Who has experience, knowledge, wisdom about it? Who doesn't like the direction that we're going to take this? Who could be a barrier? Who has influence? Who has power? Who has resources? Who could help us? So that could lead you to too many people. So you start with a core group. Some people have some energy around it. And as time goes by, you're creating a social system in which that engagement becomes more and more positive, and more people want to join into it. So, yeah, but you're doing this, you're building the system over a longer period of time through a series of smaller networks that then get connected to each other. Yeah.
And I suppose if we're thinking about our primary care systems and primary care networks, then those are certain bits that we can take into that as well, can't we? About processes and primary care networks and how they work.
Yeah, primary care networks, are interesting because they, in some ways, are a whole system, right? They touch on so many aspects of health and care and well-being, and so they're places, if you want to go to work on changing the nature of relationships, of the nature of our relationship to each other in the context of health and well-being. Primary care networks are a great place to go, and especially now that they're nascent. They're just really just being born, even if they've been around a couple of years, and so it's a great place to start. And they require so much. I mean, think of the stakeholders that are part of the primary care network. It really is very expansive and can reach into. It can be a driver of change for the system as a whole.
Yeah. Julie has just put something in the chat. Julie, do you want to unmute and explain your comment there?
Hi. Yeah. I suppose really it's the work that we've done with our comms and engagement team, and probably organisations like Health Watch, so they're our voluntary sector organisations, and thinking of, we need ways in to get the information. So if we build a little nucleus, we've got to make sure that we've got little channels in, so sort of like a hub and spoke thing, that enables us to grow in a meaningful way.
Yes, absolutely. Could you say more about the hub and spoke, Julie?
Yeah, it's quite an old methodology, I think, and I suppose if you look at a cycle wheel, so there's the exterior rim, isn't there, and there's the mechanism in the middle, and then there's like the spokes that come out. So there's stuff that happens on the exterior, and it's how we link everything together. So you've got the middle that begins to make decisions, but we need the information to come in from the exterior to enable us to make the positive changes. That makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. The one thing I would say about that is the example I was giving about the Army. I actually think is true for where we are now in health and care. So many decisions and actions need to be taken in this complex environment that can't wait for a decision or an order or a direction hypothetically from above. That we need to be in a place where we're sharing a view so deeply about what it is we're trying to do and how we need to do it, that I can trust you to go do what you need to do in a moment when something happens. And I think in some ways, if you look back at COVID, many people look back at COVID, would find some of those qualities that I just mentioned in the response to COVID. There are other responses as well. I'm not saying that it was paradise, because it certainly wasn't. It was very difficult, challenging. But the possibility of trusting one another, and trusting one another because we have evidence to trust. We know that that Julie knows her stuff really well, and that in a moment when it's needed, when she's called on, she can act without being told how to act. Her judgment is actually best, and that's one of the places we certainly want to get to in the world is there.
There's another couple of comments. Hopefully we've got time for this. We've got a couple of minutes left, which is, what tips are there to break down hierarchical culture? That's one of them. And would you advocate for matrix working within the NHS? I feel this would create that culture of ownership and engagement, honesty and openness. So sort of two separate comments there from two different people.
What was the first one again, Nigel? I'm sorry.
What tips are there to break down hierarchical culture?
Yeah. Well, one is, the history of humankind. Sorry, that's a joke. But there are so many examples of extreme hierarchy absolutely collapsing on itself. But to be practical and specific, one is that you start working in non-hierarchical ways, because confronting the hierarchy actually is unlikely to work. It's likely to, like provoking identity, it's likely to create more resistance. And people often feel that things have moved out of control when the hierarchy is. Another way of doing it, though, is that the next time you're asked to take on a problem to solve, to pull together a group of people to solve it together, and to do that in a way that makes you peers. There isn't you try and work the best you can with your understanding of what it would be like to be a peer network. Another really practical tip, I've been involved a lot in my career on communities of practice, and if you don't know those are kind of social network ways of getting at knowledge about what's working and what isn't in a system. And because they're social organizations, they're really, in addition to producing great results, they're fun for people. They have life. You make good friends. And so those are a couple. I'm sorry, I lost track of the last one.
The last one was, would you advocate for matrix working within the NHS? I feel that this would create a culture of ownership, engagement, honesty, and openness. That was from Amy again, so thanks, Amy, for the comment.
So, all right, Amy, I would say this. The second part of that question is what you're trying to do. The first part is just another structure. So matrix working can work, and it can also fail miserably. I many years ago was involved in research around matrix organizations that shows that one terrible flaw in it is that people have more than one boss. So when you have more than one boss, who's the most powerful person in the triangle? You, not the bosses, right? Because you get to play them off against one another if you're strategic in this. But on the other hand, matrix working could really work. It's just staying focused on what you're trying to do with it. And what you're trying to do is, to create honest and open relationships, working collaboratively together, all the qualities that you want to bring about could be there through a matrix organization or through a traditional organization or through something you haven't thought of before. It's just staying attuned and staying connected to what it is you're trying to do, the qualities you're trying to bring about. Thank you.
There's one last question or comment that's come in, but I think this is really, really interesting, which is, why are people afraid to question hierarchy?
Oh, for a very good reason. It can be, it can be deadly, actually, in an organization to question the hierarchy. That's why I said, the other response about, finding non-hierarchical ways of acting so that you're actually enacting the future that you want to bring, rather than confronting the present that no longer works, right? That's my take on it.
Great, thanks, Myron. So we're just over time, so I don't know whether there's some sort of summing up you wanted to do around this bit, or some key messages for us.
I would say that we are all kind of struggling with change, and the kinds of things that I've been describing, I think if they're true, you have an experience of them already, right? And that, the maxims, for instance, I believe if living systems tells us something about how we are together in social situations, in organizational situations, in the healthcare system, whatever it is, if it is at all true, we should have that embodied experience within us. When we tell the story through this lens of systems, it should feel truer than telling the story through the lens of the mechanical organization. And I think it does. And, I think if you want to bring about the organizations you want to bring about, there's tons of people standing around, sitting around with you who feel the same way, who haven't found their voice yet. You can help each other find voice. You can find those things that matter to you and to the system and go after them and try and create them anew. So I think you are all incredibly brave. You spend enormous amounts of time in organizations that both want to deliver great results and sometimes find it hard because of the bureaucracy they've created to get in their own way. And so, one of the things we know is that you find a way around that. So congratulations and keep up the good work.
Great. Thanks very much, Myron. So I think what we'll do is draw this session to a close in a minute. I just want to thank Myron again for giving us a thought-provoking hour on systems, on change, on how we maybe perceive the world. And it might be that we come back to this at another PLT or a different educational event for those that are interested in it. So we just keep this live for you. So please do sort of contact me if that's something that you would be interested in. So coming to the end of this session, like I say, and the next sessions are on Microsoft Teams. And your links will have been sent to you. Please remember that we need feedback about those and for all of the afternoon. So please do give us those. And once again, I just want to say thank you to you all for all your work that you're doing and have done. And hopefully it won't be long before we're meeting together soon with a more face-to-face PLT. So I'll leave the session there, and we'll see you in your breakout sessions in about 10 to 15 minutes time. Thanks very much, everybody.